In the years after I left Islam, in the early 2000s, the world was very different. Criticism and pushback against Christianity was very common but pretty rare for Islam. Now, in the age of the internet, with the sea of apostasy rising everywhere, attacking this Arab ideology is increasingly commonplace. But few have the articulation and courage of Christopher Hitchens, an absolutely towering opponent of organised religion. In one of his last debates, he outlines the absurdity of referring to Islam as peaceful. Islam's tendency to dominate and subjugate others is not a bug, but a feature.
Is there anyone in this room who would care to arbitrate that question? Who is to say? Where is the authority that defines who is a true son of the prophet or true interpreter of his work? Part of the problem to begin with, and it's part of the problem because it is a religion, is that it's perfectly true to say we don't know who the true Muslims are. How right that is, who does speak for it. Only the second problem with defining Islam as peaceful, only the second problem with defining it as peaceful has to do with the fact that it's highly fissile and highly schismatic, that there is a civil war going on within it, the religion of peace. As we speak, at least one civil war between the votaries of this religion of peace is already taking place, and some of it is exported outside that world into ours, very salient fact. The first reason, though, is this. Islam makes very large claims for itself, very large claims indeed. It claims to be the last and final religion, the last and final revelation. When you see bumper stickers, everyone says you can't reduce major things to a bumper sticker. It's not my idea to have bumper stickers saying Islam is the solution. It's a well-known slogan, actually, of parties associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. They say Islam is the solution for everything. It takes care of all your life and the one to come. Sexuality, political economy, banking, diet, relations with other religions, everything. It's a total solution. What is creepy about the word total? I hope I don't have to tell an audience like this. It's the first 5 letters of the word totalitarian. It's absolute. It's absolute. It's all-inclusive. It's unanswerable. And oddly, for a religion that makes such large claims, notice another thing about Islam, it doesn't particularly like having these claims questioned or scrutinized. In other words, just as there is with all religions an inverse relationship between the claims they make and the evidence they can produce for them, you must have noticed that, with Islam, a younger religion, and perhaps therefore more in its first flush, there's an extraordinarily strong willingness to say that any challenge to its absolutist claims is by definition profane. And profanity and blasphemy can be the antecedent to very severe punishment, and often are, for Muslims and for non-Muslims. And this is not a road of peace, in my submission. Thus my first point completed. The claim to govern everything from hygiene to sex and the afterlife, which contains detailed prescriptions for the good and bad versions of itself, again strikes me as somewhat totalitarian, and they're both based upon two very, very questionable and not very peaceful concepts. One is the idea of a perfect human being, the Prophet Muhammad, and the other is the idea of a perfect book, the Quran, the recitation. Now, the category perfect human primate or mammal and the category flawless book that could possibly not use any kind of change, revision, or editing are categories that do not exist. There are no members of these categories. Therefore, any challenge to this faith is bound to lead to heresy and to schism, and does. And just as all forms of absolutism and totalitarianism, leader worship and revealed truth, unalterable text, always do, because they can break, perhaps, but they cannot bend. And thus the latent potential of violence between them, among them, as well as within them, is very great. And at any moment, someone is in danger of being accused of being an apostate or an unbeliever. There is, after all, because no Christian claims this about the Bible anymore, no Jew claims it about the Pentateuch. After all, yes, there is just one book that's completely word and letter perfect from the first time it was not even written down, but recited. Now, demands that you believe the impossible do not lead to peaceful outcomes. Nor do they lead to peaceful or tolerant regimes. And I'm not going to ask you which Muslim country you would like to live in. I don't know whether Professor Ramana will tell us which one he would pick if he had to, because I don't have to ask you a question like that, because it's already in your mind. Sexual repression doesn't lead to peace. The idea that women are inferior to men is a profound cause of unease, let's say the least of it. All religions make some form of this claim. Islam seems to make it less apologetically than most. Claims that the world will come to an end in an apocalyptic form, which will lead to the victory of one religion or another, are not peaceful either. It's possible, perhaps, I haven't exhausted all my remarks, that the endless teaching of battle stories to children and the stories of lethal feuds from 7th century Arabia don't lead to peace, or the forcing of children to memorize and retell such stories by rote doesn't lead to peace either. It's arguable that peace isn't attainable at all. It may be arguable in some forms, and sometimes in places that religion isn't even desirable. But it will not come by the fanatical adoption of a man-made text and a man-made supreme leader. Nothing but war and tyranny has ever come from the adoption of formulae like these. The only way to moral and intellectual satisfaction, even temporary, perhaps only temporary, but of any kind at all, comes to those who are willing to take the great risk of thinking for themselves at all hazards and trying to share the benefits of that tolerance and that open-mindedness with others. And with that, for now, I'll rest my case. Thank you very much. I don't like the idea of a paradise reward for martyrs. Don't like it. It's not me somehow. Don't like the account. Don't like the early accounts of village squabbles with the local Jews who've taken a look at the new claimant to be the Messiah and decided about him what they decided about the previous claimant. He's no good. He's not up to snuff. Do you think the Jews are ever going to be forgiven for that, by the way? For rejecting 2 in a row? I don't think so. And I don't see why they should hope for forgiveness either. And still I'm allowed to stand here and say this, and there are many parts of Europe I couldn't do that anymore, or I'd have to be very careful in who I'd invited for the audience. I couldn't do it easily on the air, couldn't do it easily in print, couldn't do it easily in public, couldn't do it on certain campuses, couldn't do it with certain publishing houses. Now, all of this has been done to us by the wrong Muslims. Well, let's get together then, isolate who these wrong Muslims are, who've imposed a culture of violence-backed censorship upon us, and let's get rid of them and have an honest discussion about the text and the reader. And a multicultural system has to look rather askance, I think, on a religion whose preachers and websites openly make threats against people like myself, against the Jewish people, against the Hindus, who, for heaven's sake, aren't even monotheists, can be killed on almost any pretext. To speak as you did of the Ottoman Empire as a place where there were not just Muslims, but Christians and Jews, is either not to know yourself, or to expect others to have forgotten, or not to know what it meant to be a non-Muslim under the Caliphate, or under any similar theocratic Muslim authority to this day. No, what we need, secularism is the only guarantee of religious freedom, and yours and that of every other Muslim we will defend. But you won't be surprised that we have some questions for you in the meanwhile. Thank you. I don't know, I can't shake what I saw once on the BBC from someone whose career in London I followed. I don't know if you know him, you wouldn't like him, Anjum Chowdhury. It's a very well-known noisemaker around London, complaining about secularism, Judaism, all this kind of thing, and he'd been in trouble with the law a few times, and was interviewed on the BBC, went on about how nothing would change until the green flag of Islam was flying over Downing Street and Buckingham Palace and so forth. And was asked, I thought quite mildly by the BBC interviewer, he said, well, if this is the way you feel about Sharia and about total Islamic rule, wouldn't you feel happier moving to a country where they already had it? And which is, a polite question, but a rather cheap one. But still, what didn't prepare me for the answer? Chowdhury looked straight at the guy and straight into camera and said, what makes you think this is your country? I thought it was a very good question. Now, why do you feel, I think I know partly why you feel, why do you feel it's necessary to affirm that? And of course a Muslim should learn the language, should obey the laws, should observe the customs and so on. Most immigrants don't feel they, so to speak, absolutely have to say that. The answer, I suspect, is that it's embarrassing to notice that in places like as far apart as Sweden and as Spain, there are groups of people who say their countries should be part of the caliphate and that that's why they've come here. And if it wasn't for those people, you wouldn't be in this position. So it seems to me that in order to be consistent, you should fear them and dislike them, find them morally and intellectually repulsive, at least as much as, if not more, than I do. And I don't say that you don't. But I do think that is the urgent priority. On the lady's question about where would be the best country to live if you were a Muslim and wanting to be a member of a sexual or gender minority, or I think she said a female or a homosexual. So hard to confuse. Actually, the easiest place for you to live in that case would probably be, I was thinking about it while Professor Ramadan was talking, would probably be, this will be my closing statement, would almost certainly be either Bosnia-Herzegovina or Kosovo. Culturally Muslim, democratic, open societies in southern and Balkan Europe that were saved from obliteration by the power of the United States, which has never had a word of thanks for what it did in that matter. And which remains a secular country with a godless constitution.
I want to start out by noting this is not merely a philosophical or religious debate, but a sociological one. We could all just talk about why each of us think our respective religions is better, but that would get us nowhere. We need to use real-world data as a tiebreaker. When we look at the peer-reviewed studies, the data strongly favors Christianity over Islam. This really isn't a topic that even should be up for debate, because when we run the numbers, we see research has already demonstrated that Christianity is far better. And I will press him on this point throughout the debate. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying everything about Islam is bad. What I am saying, though, is that Christianity creates more optimal societies with better results. And although there are some good results associated with Islam, it produces less optimal societies and results in harmful outcomes and practices. This will be clear as I go through the data. Let's start with war and violence. Davis Brown has spent several years studying this. He conducted one of many studies on the influence of religion in interstate armed conflict, and his model has robustness checks. In terms of government religious preference, he found that Buddhism was non-significant. Christianity was strongly negatively associated with war and conflict, but Islam was positively associated with it. To quote, a state with a non-zero median Christian GRP is 60% less likely to initiate a fatal armed conflict than a state with no Christian GRP. A state with a maximum Christian GRP is 73% less likely. Whereas empirical results suggest that states with Christian GRPs are less likely to use force, they also suggest that states with Muslim GRPs are moderately more likely. At the lowest threshold of using force, a state with the median non-zero Muslim GRP is 84% more likely to resort to force than a state with no Muslim GRP. He strengthened his results in a book he published in 2019. So when a society is Muslims, we see that conflict increases. And when a society adopts Christianity, this contributes to conflicts decreasing. Joshua Wright, in his work, has found that Muslims score higher in religious fundamentalism. But fundamentalism leads to racial prejudice, hostility towards value-violating outgroups, and support for violence against outgroups. He says the evidence that Muslims tend to have more fundamental beliefs than other religious groups suggests that Muslims may be more susceptible to what Hitchens Slade term the terrorist meme, an ideal expressing selective interpretations of the Quran that is spread throughout the Islamic world. In this way, fundamentalist beliefs may act as a facilitator for religious terrorism. Similarly describes how the jihadi message successfully motivates Muslims because it is a natural extension of the dominant narrative in the Islamic world and is minimally counterintuitive for most Muslims. Higher levels of fundamentalism may enhance the acceptance of the jihadi message. So Christianity results in less harmful outcomes due to less fundamentalism than what Islam fosters. M. Stephen Fish found that there is more political violence in Muslim countries. In fact, it is more than double what is found in Christian ones. Now, he says the Muslim effect is small, but still has to conclude, all we can say with certainty is that Islamists do bear some responsibility for major episodes of political violence in the post-war world.
A major destructive factor is that in Islam there is no separation of religion from the state and its apparatus. This magnifies the problems inherent in Islam to a self-destructive level, destroying the foundation of a free society and linking state terror directly to Islamic scripture. And it is not just non-Muslims that suffer. The encroaching totalitarian control of the Sharia provides benefit to none under its power. It seems Muslims in the West are completely oblivious to this, despite the litany of examples across the Islamic world.
Muslims like Abdullah al-Andalusi have argued the world would be better if Muslims were in charge and acted as the world's police.
Islam has a brilliant method to grant the prayers of everyone around the world, Muslim and non-Muslim, who pray for peace, which is, I call it the Pax Islamica, from the Latin word pax, meaning peace, like the Pax Romanum, right? The peace of Rome. Because if you truly want peace around the world, then you need to take on the position of policeman, right? You need to then be the guardians of everyone.
However, the peer-reviewed data shows the opposite. We would see an increase in conflict, terrorism, violence, discrimination, persecution, and authoritarianism. These negative consequences cannot be entirely attributed to other factors. The studies I cited factor in other variables, like foreign occupation, armed groups, economic development, etc. Even after accounting for multiple variables, Islam was still found to be tied to these negative consequences. The world would not get better if we increased Islam's influence. It would get much worse. The question you might be asking is why? Why is it that Islam creates so many problems for humanity? It's because of many factors that are inherent in Islam. First, Islam lacks a robust concept of the separation of church and state, like what we find in the West. The separation of church and state emerged slowly out of the Christian tradition, and came from the idea that Jesus said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render to God the things that are God's." This fostered the idea that the spiritual and the worldly powers can be separate. The priest can focus on spiritual matters, and the officials in government can focus on earthly matters. A priest cannot use the state to force religious observance, and the state cannot use its power to force the clergy to do their bidding. Without the state working or coercing for a particular religion, this allows religious freedom, which has been associated with positive benefits, like better quality of life and economic prosperity. Also, when you have to figure out what to believe, rather than a government telling you what to believe, it increases your critical thinking skills, which leads to more intelligent individuals who go on to advance society in multiple ways. But when government and religion are tied together, the state often becomes the enforcer of religious dogma. Islam lacks a distinction between church and state. It's inherently a political religion, where the state is required to force Sharia. You must remember Islam is not merely a system about spiritual matters. It is meant to encompass all aspects of life: political, cultural, family, and spiritual matters. Grimm and Finke say, social restrictions are higher within the Islamic tradition, not only because it looks to the community of Muslims and its religious leaders to regulate religion, but also because there are movements throughout the Muslim world that advocate a greater role for Islam in the public sphere, including implementing a stricter version of Sharia. By its own nature, Islam in its purest form cannot have a separation of church and state, like what Christianity fosters. This means that when disagreements happen in Islam, groups break off into different sects or schools of thought, which happens a lot. They won't merely bicker over spiritual matters, but political and cultural matters as well. And because Islam is necessarily political, their religious disputes will spill over into political disputes, which will lead to infighting for political power. As Toff says, Islam has had yet no equivalent to the separation of religion and state and the decline of Christian religious political authority, as seen in the West after the 30 Years' War and the Treaty of Westphalia. The Islamic doctrine of Salafist jihad may make Muslims, whether locally or as transnational jihadists, more likely to fight in the name of Islam out of a sense of religious obligation. Elsewhere, Toff says, the process of religious outbidding would explain why Islam is so much more likely to be involved in religious civil wars than other religions. Islam has a specific, and today very active, obligation to defend by force component. Young men answered these calls by traveling to areas of conflict, often bringing cash and arms with them, to satisfy what they believed to be a religious obligation to defend Islam against attacks from non-believers. A lack of separation of church and state means there are religious motivations to advance Islam politically, and not just through evangelism. Davis Brown notes there is a scriptural basis for fighting as well. Surah 9 says, "Fight those who do not believe in Allah and the last day, nor comply with what Allah and His Messenger have forbidden, nor embrace the religion of truth from among those who were given the scripture, until they pay the tax, willingly submitting, fully humbled. The Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah, while the Christians say the Messiah is the son of Allah. Such are their baseless assertions, only parroting the words of earlier disbelievers. May Allah condemn them. How can they be deluded?" Islam's goal, according to its own texts, is perpetual war and conquest until all submit to the dominion of Islam. Brown says, many of God's revelations to Muhammad, which today constitute the Quran, coincided with military activity, and the victories and defeats associated with Islam's origins all contributed to how the Ummah defined itself. In addition, the early Muslims inherited a fatalistic determinism from their pre-Islamic Arab culture, with the resulting belief that all events were determined absolutely by God. Muslim jurists regarded jihad as the means to establish God's political supremacy, which was necessary to the supreme authority of God's word. Jihad was not merely the extension of the abode of Islam, but also the enforcement of the politico-religious authority. Early Muslim jurists repudiated perpetual treaties with non-Muslims, referring to passages in the Quran like, "Take not the Jews and the Christians for friends." For Muslims, the world is seen in two abodes, the house of Islam, and all others are in the house of war. Anything not under the dominance of Islam is considered to be at war with the house of Islam. Revival movements that invoke Dar al-Islam usually focus on a stricter application of Sharia, which in turn leads to more conflict and persecution. Muslim preachers even note more conflicts and the subjugation of non-Muslims will follow if Islam grows.
That is why when Muslims go and conquer the adjacent country, what do? We kill them all? No. The Prophet says, the first thing you do is call them to Islam. If they accept it, leave them. Khalas, they're Muslims. We go. We don't want your country. We don't want your land. We don't want your wealth. If they refuse, then tell them Allah obliged upon you to pay taxation, jizya. Stay kafir as you wish, no problem. But you have to give us a percentage, and you enjoy sitting in your homes and in your country and live your life normally. But the ruling is for Sharia. So you do not open nightclubs, you do not fornicate in the streets, you do not, no, Sharia rules, but you live your life, you marry, you have children, you enjoy your life, but publicly, Islam rules. If they refuse, then we have to fight. And if we fight you, then we capture you, you become our slaves, and we take your land, and you take where, because you refuse, I give you two good options. This is the strength of Islam. But nowadays, forget this. Maybe in the coming 40, 50 years, when the Muslims become strong as they're supposed to be, and they are focused and Islamically oriented.
Grimm and Finke find similar results in their book in terms of persecution. We propose that the battle between Muslims over the understanding and enactment of Sharia law is closely related to the religious restrictions and persecution that often follow. Although this may be in part a reaction against the centuries of Western domination, we find that this is primarily a struggle within Islam, rather than with the West. Islam's dominance means people of the book must be fully submissive, but that is interpreted differently between different groups in Islam. Discrimination and persecution follow when certain Muslims feel that minority groups living under their rule have not fully submitted or may be conspiring to rebel. The command to make Jews and Christians submit, that we are the worst of creatures and cannot even be friends with Muslims, can lead to a sense of superiority among many Muslims, and that the people of the book must be dominated, and that can manifest in horrible ways. Grimm and Finke say, in our analysis of the cases, we find that persecution in Muslim-majority countries is less often associated with ethnic conflict and more often associated with such things as the vision that differing religious groups have for their society. The most lethal religion-related armed conflict in recent decades occurred during the Sudanese Civil War, which resulted in more than 6 million people being killed or displaced between 1989 and 2005. Religion played a central role in splitting the country into warring sides, primarily pitting government forces from the Muslim-majority North against an array of opposition forces from the South, which is largely Christian. The main dividing line was not ethnicity, but religion itself, as the North sought to make the country an Islamic republic, with Sharia as the law of the land. Adding to this terrifying reality, Joshua Wright found in his work that Muslims score higher in religious fundamentalism than Christians do. But fundamentalism leads to racial prejudice, hostility toward value-violating outgroups, and support for violence against outgroups. Brown and Choi note that several texts of the major schools of Sunni Islam support violence in multiple ways. The largest school is Hanafi. Its founder's original works are unavailable, but his disciple wrote extensively and has an entire chapter devoted to executing apostates of Islam. Brown and Choi note the word for martyr often appears in several authoritative texts of the Hanafi school, as well as in the Hanbali school and to a lesser extent the other two major schools. Although the word martyr appears nowhere in the translated texts of the CR, the word does appear extensively in the Sahihain, the Sahih Bukhari, and the Sahih Muslim, Bouquet offering a scriptural basis for radical Muslims' incentives to martyrdom. Also notes that the Sahih Bukhari offers the greatest support for the practice. These foundational and authoritative texts offer religious incentives to carry out violent attacks on apostates and non-Muslims. Of course, many Muslims claim terrorist attacks are not proper Islamic behavior. But the problem is there is no set agreement on how to properly interpret Islamic law. So these violent views arise naturally from Islamic thought, regardless of the fact that other Muslims disagree. Historian Raphael Israeli says, there is no doubt that for Muslims, whose pursuit of jihad is an active and preponderant aspect of their lives, particularly so among the Palestinians, the question of reward in paradise constitutes a crucial portion of their worldview and plays a major role in their battle motivation. Islam's propensity towards violence, conflict, discrimination, and authoritarianism is nothing new. This is how Islam began and has manifested throughout history. Let's remember that Muhammad was a warlord. He personally participated in 27 campaigns and directed another 59 during the last 9 years of his life. He even used the spoils of raids to lure people to Islam by playing on their greed. Robert Hoyland says, Muhammad initially attempted to spread his message solely by preaching, but he received a hostile reception from most of his fellow Meccans and had to make a journey in search of refuge, ending up in the nearby oasis town of Medina. The time of peaceful preaching was over now. He decided, and it was time to use force to carry out what he perceived to be God's will. To cover some examples, Ibn Ishaq tells us of a man named Abu Afaq, an elderly man who wrote a poem criticizing people for becoming Muslims. Muhammad demanded that he be killed, and so the old man was murdered in his sleep. Then a woman named Asma heard what the Muslims had done, and so she wrote a poem calling for people to stand against Islam. Muhammad ordered that she be killed as well. When the murderer reported back to Muhammad, he said, 2 goats won't butt their heads about her. The Jews of Qurayza resisted Muhammad's authority. Muhammad's army surrounded them and besieged them for 25 nights. After they achieved victory, we read then the apostle went out to the market of Medina, which is still its market today, and dug trenches in it. Then he sent for them and struck off their heads in those trenches, as they were brought out to him in batches. There were 600 or 700 in all, though some put the figure as high as 800 or 900. Every boy who had reached puberty was killed. Muhammad divided the women, children, and property among his soldiers, taking 1/5 of the spoils for himself. As Muhammad continued his conquest, he allowed his men to take the wives of those they defeated in battle as sex slaves. We even see sleeping with sex slaves as sanctioned in the Quran. According to Sahih Muslim, he planned to forcibly expel all the Jews and Christians from Arabia, and it was completed shortly after his death. After he finally died, his companions carried out one of the largest campaigns of conquest and violence the world has ever seen. Many civilians were killed, tortured, or enslaved. When they came to Cyprus, Hoyland says, the Arabs roamed freely across the mountains and the plains, hunting for plunder and slaves. They winkled the natives out of the cracks in the ground, like eggs abandoned in the nest. The Arabs ravaged all the lands of Armenia, Albania, and Sunik, and stripped all the churches. They seized as hostages the leading princes of the country and the wives, sons, and daughters of many people. One monk recorded that robber bands went to distant parts into the islands, bringing back captives from all the peoples under the heavens. From the Hindu Kush, they demanded an annual tribute of apparently 1,000 of their most beautiful boys, each one holding in his hands a golden cup, a delicious taste for Muslims of the delights of paradise. When slave revolts occurred, the Muslim conquerors complained, "Our slaves are rebelling against us," complained the Kufan notables, "yet they are our booty, which God has granted us together with these lands." Davis Brown says, Islamic law is frozen at a time when Islamdom was very strong and successful, its technology equivalent or superior to that of its rivals, its higher learning flourishing, its military campaigns largely successful, and Islam itself being propagated rapidly. These characteristics naturally induced a historical perception of self-superiority, and that perception has strongly influenced the Islamic perception of otherness. In Islam, the other consists of the forces of deception, unbelief, and shirk, as opposed to the forces of the straight path and submission to God. Such a worldview is a recipe for Islamic hostility towards non-Islam. Now, it is true that other civilizations have engaged in genocide, slavery, and crimes against humanity. The West, for example, has its problems and history of crimes. But the sociological research supports the notion that this was not as tied to religion, like what we see with Islamic culture. Christianity has not created the same negative effects that come out of Islam, and has generated a ton of moral progress. The truth is, if you are promoting and spreading Islam, you are making the world a worse place. because there is no denying that the more Islam spreads, the worse things will be for humanity. Perhaps we should hope this one hadith turns out to be true. Verily, Islam started as something strange, and it would again revert to its old position of being strange, just as it started, and it would recede between two mosques, just as a serpent crawls back into its hole.